Hello, and welcome back to the fourth episode in my four-part series where I'm talking to Don Berg, who is an educational researcher, philosopher, and student of psychology. He is really focused on bringing student agency into schools and classrooms, and he's written some fabulous books all about this, including Schooling for Holistic Equity and the Agentic Schools Manifesto. In today's conversation, we are talking about student agency in practical terms, what it could look like for a traditional educator in a mainstream school to borrow some ideas from democratic progressive education into their classroom tomorrow. So let's jump into this fourth and final conversation with Don on my channel. But if you're enjoying these, head on over to his channel because we're going to continue doing some interviews together. All right, let's get started. Hi, Don. It's great to see you again. So to jump in, what aspects of democratic and progressive education could teachers actively and realistically bring into their classrooms?
So the way to think about it is, what needs can we better support? So under the rubric of student voice, you're going to be focusing on more autonomy and trying to figure out what's going on, or it could actually be under relatedness, but depending on what the voice is about. But so things like, how can we be more collaborative? How can we bring them into the conversation? And you can work your way into this. You don't have to like suddenly change everything all at once. You can say, okay, what are the opportunities that I have? Can I start small? Start with broadening the possibilities for assignments. What are the possibilities for the way you're organizing content? Can you help have them can you incorporate interest? Now, I might be critical of some of those things at points, because if you get stuck there, then that's not going to do it. But you have to see it as a long-term process of like, okay, I'm deepening my professional practice, moves towards better support of autonomy, competence, and relatedness, primary human needs, and how am I shifting my school environment to get my needs better supported? That's you being the agent of your learning and saying, I have these needs too. Where do I see the barriers for my learning, the barriers for my needs? Or just, are my colleagues understanding that children have the same need for autonomy that I do, or that we do as adults?
Yeah, that looked so easily because
Yeah.
when we're thinking about teachers, we are the model of the classroom. We're the expert, the facilitator, and we wear so many hats. But we also need to take care of our own autonomy, relatedness, and competence, which
Yep.
typical schools tend to have more of a structure that asks you to put those aside. But
Right.
when you're aware of your own needs, you can also be more aware of what your students require.
And looking for what are the opportunities we have in the situation. So one of the things I liked to do so I worked in after school programs that very traditional, like I worked at a after school program at a public school, after school program for a private school, is one of the things I did with kids when I had the opportunity was to look at the outside world. So here's my kids and we're in a circle, and then we say, look outside. And it might be the director of the program. It might be the way the school operates. It might be the way society expects us to be. But you look with them at the outside and say, what do we have to do here? And just recognize there are things you have to do. You don't want to do them, but you have to do them. And so recognizing that, and I call it a common enemy, is like you're getting in league with them and saying, that's something we have to deal with. How are we going to do that? It could be curricular. It could be just, like dealing with teenagers and saying, yeah, they make you get here at 8 a.m. That's not ideal for you, but how are we going to deal with that? And it might not be something like thinking about just 8 a.m. You can help them and coach them and strategize. How are you going to deal with that? But you can't actually do anything about that. You can't do more than coach them in that particular situation, because they have to deal with their family. They have to deal with whatever their life is outside of school in order to get to school on time. But that's a way. The strategy is get in league with your students in handling life.
Interesting. Yeah, it's kind of making me think about how if we're learning something in math class that they're all fussing about, it's like fractions are
Yep.
so hard, I don't get the decimals, fractions, conversion, saying that we're going to go through this process together as I'm guiding you, because I also don't know everything about this. And I think that's one thing that makes teachers very uncomfortable is
Mm-hmm.
saying to students, like, I want to learn this too, because we're
Right.
put in that position of authority. But if we create the fractions decimals challenge and say, I need you guys to help me understand this, like pretend that I'm just walking into the classroom and I haven't been in all of our lessons. Teach Miss Christina how fractions and decimals work. It
Right.
takes a little bit of the stress off of them for saying, like, I have to understand this to such a level that I can reproduce it, because now
Right.
you're just sharing with your teacher. And your
Right.
teacher, hopefully, is not a scary adversary. There's someone who you want to show what you're learning to.
Another way would be, instead of pretend it's me, to say, let's teach next year's third graders. Like,
Yeah,
if you're
that
the
too.
third grade class, what would we need to do with this lesson in order to do it for them?
Mm-hmm.
This lesson, I really enjoyed this lesson as your teacher, but it seems like you guys aren't really onto it. I think maybe I messed up. Maybe you can help me, because next year I'm going to teach this lesson again, but because I have to. But you can help me. What should be done differently? How would you do this lesson? So you can, once again, recruit them. Even as teacher, you can say, I need to learn to do this better. What do you suggest? And so one of the things that you can emphasize is that we are all learners.
Yes, definitely.
No matter what it is you're doing, you have more to learn. And so if you can put yourself on their side and say, I'm a learner too, and I need to learn better on this, and what would you do to teach this lesson? And
Yeah.
so that's one of the things I found was really helpful. One of the ways I did it was, so I had second graders in this after school program, and I wanted to be able to go off campus for little field trips, kind of things, just in the afternoon. And so one of the things I said to you guys, look, if you guys all ran away, I couldn't catch more than one or two of you. Like, if you just run away, then there's nothing I can do. And so part of what that was doing was having them recognize that I'm limited and that my responsibility is for them to be safe, but I can't do that job if they don't cooperate. And so that was something I've used a number of times, to sort of say, let's be real. Even if I am an adult and I have authority, I'm just one person and I can't do everything. So I need your help. In the psychology, it's like I can say, oh, okay, I understand my autonomy in a certain way, but I don't understand how you're doing it. And you are different than me. So either it's different for you, or maybe you have a cultural difference. We can always be sort of going to them and saying, how can we do this better together?
And that's like the fundamental democratic practice of including them in the decision making, helping them feel like they have that voice and that space and ownership. It's making
Yep.
me also think about asking the students, like, do you need a brain break after this lesson or before this lesson? And if we're having challenges with transitions in the hallway, what do you guys think would actually help us get to music class on time? In an organized
Mhm.
way, because when they have more ownership of the decision, they're also more likely to actually do it.
Right. And an important thing there, so there's a movie called The Ron Clark Story. So Ron
Mm-hmm.
Clark is a famous educator, very mainstream. He went from, can't remember which Carolina, but he went from one of the Carolinas to New York City and taught these impoverished schools, and he has his own academy now in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
But famously, there's a scene from the movie about him in which he's trying to get kids who are chronically misbehaving to line up in the hallway and stuff like that. And he uses the famous, I'm sure a lot of teachers use the technique, is use your peer pressure and say, we're not going to go anywhere until X does Y, like child X does whatever, complies. So you're using the peer pressure thing. So first of all, that's coercive. I'm not saying you should never do it. I'm saying recognize that coercion has costs and they may not be what you really want to pay.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so understand that the way you do it, am I doing it in a way that supports their autonomy, relatedness, and competence? Um,
Mm-hmm.
so it's not about just dissolving into a blob of no structure. It's what structure is supportive of their needs. Because in fact, the psychology is really clear. People have this notion that autonomy and structure are the opposite. In order to have autonomy, you have no structure. And what they found is actually, no, you cannot support autonomy unless you have a structure that provides that support. So it is both, not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, you need a scaffold to be able to create a space for autonomy. Autonomy is not a free for all, it's the ability to create within that structure, within that zone. Very interesting. It's making me think about engagement and motivation for students because so many teachers struggle with what do I do if the student doesn't want to learn? What if they're just messing around? And parents also are very focused on like, my student needs to be in school and be actively participating. So when we think about bringing ideas from democratic education into a traditional school, what would be your advice around motivation?
Okay, so understand that motivation is a spectrum. The broad sense is autonomous motivations and controlled motivations. Those are positive for well-being, negative for well-being. In other words, controlled motivations, kind of bad, autonomous motivations, usually good. Now, to break it down a little more so you get a clearer sense of where the boundary is that let's start at the extreme negative, which is a motivation. So like if the kid can't articulate a reason for doing something, that's a lack of motivation. Okay, it's just not even there. They may, so this is an interesting thing. They may still do it, but they don't understand why they're doing it or what they're doing it. That's a lack of motivation. Then you have external regulation. External regulation is the rewards and punishments. It's entirely instrumental. It says, I'm doing this because I want to get them off my back, or I want that reward. So just completely extrinsic. Now, the next one, so there's three on the controlled side: a motivation, external regulation, trying to remember, introjected, Freudian term. Introjections are it's slightly more internal because it's about a relationship to somebody else. And it's about, I would feel guilty if I didn't do that. I would feel pride if I accomplished that. Or whatever it is, it's relational based. Okay, so that's all the negative. Those are all have negative consequences for well-being. Now, there is such a thing as a positive interact, which can actually be kind of neutral for well-being, but we still put it on the controlled side because it's not great. 3, the autonomous side. Identified regulation is when you can come up with logical reasons for doing it. Like, say, you play soccer. Why do I play soccer? Well, because my friends are there. That's an instrumental way of doing it. I could learn leadership. I'll be healthier because I do it. Okay, that's fine. That's identified because they come with reasons, they can articulate it, and that's slightly positive for well-being. Then there's integrated. Integrated means I do this because that's the kind of person I am. I'm in my family, everyone does sports, so I do a sport. I do this because at my school, everyone does this thing, and so I do that thing. For me personally, it was, like I'm in this college prep magnet program in high school. So, grades are a really important thing. So I pay really important attention to grades and, like that stuff. I was very mainstream in that way. It was magnet at college prep, but it was like still like I was doing it for those reasons. Integrated, but not intrinsically motivated. And that's the final one. Is intrinsic motivation is the thing where you're just doing it for the pure enjoyment. It's engaged. It's just oh, it's great. All three of those, if you can identify those things, if you can be doing it for somewhat instrumental, like in other words, I'm doing it because my friends are there or because my friends are doing it, or just because you love it, all of those are positive. So motivation is this whole spectrum. And crucially, and this is the important thing people don't realize, especially if they've been emphasizing intrinsic motivation, is you can move across this spectrum. And it is just fine to use rewards and punishments to get something going. Rewards and punishments have their place. One thing I will share is that I live on a llama ranch. I train llamas. Yes. And llamas are not as food oriented as other, and like you see a lot of people using treats with dogs and things like that. There are people who can, like, sometimes you have a llama who is food motivated. We have one who was rescued from a starvation situation, and so using food kind of works for him. It's not a bad thing, but we do not rely on extrinsic motivation with our llamas. We want them to be doing it because they enjoy it, and we are confident that they can't say they enjoy it. We can't figure out if they have an identified regulation in this regard. We don't know, but we know that they love going out into the woods. So they're pack llamas. They go out there, they enjoy it, and we know they enjoy it because they're willing to get in the trail. Like one time, this was, I think, after kind of COVID lockdown and stuff, and we hadn't gone out in the wilderness for a while, like an extraordinary long period of time. And like as soon as we opened the trailer and put them out there, they were like getting in the trailer, like they were ready to go, And so we can tell from their behavior that in fact they do enjoy these things. But my point is, motivation is this spectrum. It's okay to move them across the spectrum. to say, yeah, you don't want to do this. But like for talked about cleaning and things, keep doing things they don't want to do. And even in democratic schools, there are things that they have to do, even if they don't want to. And that's where you may have to start them. Like it's literally okay to say, okay, what reward do you need to get to do this? And then, but don't rely on that. Don't make that the standard thing forever. That's something, yeah, okay. But then you need to get them to that identified place. And that's why democratic processes is very useful, is because it gets them to identified really fast, because they have the power to change the rule. And so you may have, and I know that some schools in democratic schools have gone through iterations after iteration of their how to do the chores and who's in charge. They're trying to figure out, how do we get everyone into this identified place? I get why I have to do it. I know that our community is more functional. I have more fun. I get more of what I want when I do this thing that I don't want to do, but I can make it efficient, or I can make it better, or I can figure out a way, even if I don't want to do it. And this is that's where the motivation piece is. You can never say rewards and punishments don't work. They do work, but you want them to work temporarily at best. Systems that rely exclusively on rewards and punishments are not recognizing the human needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Because when you support those, you move across. You can move people from that place of externally regulated across into more positive forms where it's good for them. Now, one thing is, you probably never move from completely extrinsically motivated to intrinsically motivated, because it's probably something that you may have. I won't say it's not possible, but for a lot of things, I've been doing chores all my life, and it doesn't mean I inherently enjoy them, but I do recognize they need to be done. My partner and I negotiate what should be the chores, but it's like, okay, she really enjoys the cooking, I kind of enjoy the cleaning, not intrinsically. So that's the whole motivation spectrum, and understanding that you can move across it is just fine is important to know.
Yeah, it makes me think that when educators have been talking so much about intrinsic motivation, we're kind of demonizing when you do have to have compliance and you do have to have kids listen to you in that moment. And instead of feeling like a bad teacher at that moment, it's like you need to have them safe and secure.
Right.
And we have to go to the cafeteria, we have to go to the bus, and you don't get to stay in class for as long as you want. It also makes me think about something that you've posted about a lot, which is the Maslow before Bloom discussion. Because in education, we know there are myths that have been prevalent for so long. And I think it wasn't until I saw some of the writings you've done that I started to put together the pieces that it's not really one or the other. Again, like it's spectrums, right?
Sort of. So to be clear, Maslow is wrong. The Maslow model is not correct, and it can be replaced by something that is scientifically sound. Now, the sentiment behind Maslow before Bloom, the sentiment is good, is there are needs that exist and have been proven, and you're going to do a lot better if you meet those needs. So to be clear, there are needs exist. What he's wrong about, and actually Maslow himself did not emphasize the hierarchy. In fact, the presentation as a pyramid was not his doing at all. There's actually a review of his work, and they went back to his actual notes, and there is no pyramids. There's no hierarchy in that sense. So the hierarchy was actually made, yeah, the hierarchy is a marketing ploy. Literally, marketing people came up with it, and it is wrong. So the idea that you would have a hierarchy of needs is wrong. Now, of course, if you suffocate and die, yeah, nothing else happens, right? Okay. But it's a trivial. It's like hierarchy is like okay, there's 4 needs that will kill you. Okay, air, water, food, and shelter. Those will kill you. Those are physiological needs, and you have to have those met. Now, there are 4 other needs that will not kill you, but they do cause increases in anxiety, depression, and other forms of psychological distress. The first one's very familiar: sleep. If you don't get sleep, it's bad. It causes a psychological distress. The lack of sleep in itself cannot kill you, but it can change you a lot and cause very serious psychological side effects when you don't have enough sleep. So sleep is very important. Now, the other 3 needs are ones we've covered before: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And so those cause the same symptoms as a lack of sleep: anxiety, depression, psychological distress more generally. So because they have the same symptomology, you kind of lump them together. But they all are the primary causes of well-being for all humans, no matter their age, no matter their culture. So no hierarchy other than just the dead, not dead. Then Maslow's the terms he used, like The one at the top, self-actualization, is kind of vague, void for vagueness from a scientific perspective. Anytime people try to actually justify his pyramid, they have to jump over backwards with trying to manipulate the definitions in order to make it work. So I have a page on my website that goes into this Maslow thing. And there's a replacement. It's called self-determination theory. And so you need to meet their needs for autonomy, competence, and sleep in order to get good learning, because all the anxiety, depression, and psychological distress undermines good learning. So you want to shift that. And then Bloom actually was another one. I just recently, a fellow that I follow, what I would consider probably an education conservative, so somebody on the other side of the spectrum from I am in a lot of ways, as a guy named Carl Hendrick. And so he and I dialogue sometimes through LinkedIn. And so he was actually saying that the Bloom thing, one, it's misunderstood, and then two, it might be questionable in other ways too. I defer to others as far as Bloom goes, but the underlying sentiment of Maslow before Bloom, sentiment, good. The actual models, you have to be really careful about them.
Yeah, because you do need to attend to the needs and support the well-being of students before they're ready to learn. I mean, if we're talking about the neuroscience of learning, the schools nowadays do teach about your amygdala and about your
Right.
stress response, the freeze, flight, and all of these things. And when teachers are aware of that, it makes sense. But then they also get stuck in feeling like shallow learning that is very repetition based or really recall based should be kept out. But again, there's a place for it. It's a balancing act where you don't want to have a certain percentage of your time be just regurgitation of information, but you also can't have constant independence where there's nothing happening, there's nothing available to learners. And
Right.
that's where we get into the democratic schools conversation of like, does this always work for every kid who's involved? Does this always work for every family? Because just like the traditional system, it's not always going to be the right fit.
Right. So if the environment actually supports their needs, and there's actually another category. So I've talked about primary. There's also secondary, particular, and derivative needs. Okay. So an example of a secondary need is benevolence or generosity. So it's secondary because there's no negative effect for neglecting it. And then you have particular needs. So if I were to go out on the street and get hit by a car and end up in the hospital on life support, I have needs in order to stay alive that are unique to whatever constellation of injuries I sustained from that car accident. Now, particular needs could look, it could be neurodivergence, creates needs that other people who are more neurotypical have, as an example. Or you can also have cultural needs. So if you think about cuisine, I live in a culture in which bugs are not food. So if I were stranded in the Amazonian jungle surrounded by all kinds of weird bugs, I could starve to death if I don't recognize them as food. Or I could accidentally kill myself by trying to eat a bug that's actually poisonous. Like, the local knowledge is really important. So that's where a culture can also define needs in a certain way because of how they like cultures can vary in how they support autonomy and how they build relatedness and how they work on what's acceptable to become competent at. So there are these variations. So that's where no school could ever meet all needs because they have a eco-political, socioeconomic, I mean, like, there's all kinds of dimensions you could figure out. So one size does not fit all if you're talking about how the needs are met. However, one size does fit all because we all have the needs. And I have a whole piece on that on my website as well. But that's where it's interesting to, when you take that perspective and you look at the universal needs, then there is something that all schools should be doing, and that's what I call agentic schools, supporting agency, because that has to be, because it's based in universals, that is the thing that all schools have to figure out. So you're correct to say no school can fit for everyone, but you have to put parameters around that. There's no such thing as a school in which their needs are undermined is good for those kids. If their needs are undermined, that school is bad for them no matter how it's organized, because the needs are being undermined. So that's the tricky bit, is even a mainstream school could be done well if it is really supporting needs. And that's where you get into some challenges because, okay, let's think about a bell curve, so a normal distribution. And one of the defining features of public schools in the USA is that they have to take everyone, even the long tails on the end of the distribution. And this is in Oregon, where I am. It is particularly difficult right now because we've had really big problems with the extreme end of where systems that are supposed to provide support for those kids who are in those nasty situations or being removed from nasty situations. We have a system that's charged with meeting their needs, but doesn't do that very well. And so there's a lack of trust in our society. So that extreme is really hard to deal with. And that's where it gets, everybody's on this distribution. And do you create a school? Like, you have to be able to have an institution that serves every segment, but then how do you accomplish that? And how do you do it in a fair way? That's where governance and state governance, national governance, and all those things, that gets very complicated. But the underlying thing is, how do we ensure needs are being met? What constraints do we have? Hopefully, no matter where you are in the distribution of the spectrum, I was on this end of, I was attending magnet programs of being smart and all that stuff, but my needs were not met. I know now in hindsight, I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't identify what. I was good at doing school, but I recognized since sixth grade that something was wrong when I couldn't articulate it until later. So when we start to focus on the needs, then we can start to change the conversation, shift away from content. I'm not saying content goes away. Even the democratic schools provide classes. The Village Free School, where I volunteered, would bring in experts on math and various subjects and skills, and then bring them in, and they would literally have. I taught psychology for a year because the students asked for it. So it doesn't mean no content. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is the priority has to be needs, then content. And so figuring that out, not in a needs will be done and then you do content, like that's not, we're talking about as a priority, as like recognizing, okay, when they get out of sorts, we have to take some extra time, take some extra effort to ensure that they're reaching that level of open-mindedness that deeper learning relies on. And that's the thing, is anxiety and depression close our minds. And this is a psychological fact. I'm talking about very specific measurable things. One of the things is, under anxiety, your field of vision can narrow. Like, literally a physiological property can happen. But it happens in these other ways too. So what conditions are necessary to open their mind? And you're human, I'm human, the teachers are human, the students are human. So those are fundamentals. That's what I call back to basics. Yeah. I propose back to basics 2.0. Yep. 1.0 was 3 R's, no nonsense in the classroom, strict obedience to the teacher. 2.0, which actually, if 2.0 principles are operating, where, I have teach governance before academics. Governance being make decisions, resolve conflicts. Governance before academics as a higher priority. Second, manage for engagement, not bookkeeping. So your grades, your test scores, and those things, that's an extra. You have to manage for engagement. If you have to make sure that they're engaged in what they're learning, then those other things will take care of themselves. And then the third principle is improve citizenship with need support. This is saying, if you simply kick them out, if you exclude them, then you are denying the opportunity to work on the relationship. Relationships cannot improve in a void. And so if they are not present, you cannot improve your relationship with them. Okay?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I think that's why we really wanted to have this conversation, because so many times when a new idea comes across someone's plate, it's scary to think about changing your status quo, to throw something else on the fire and be like, okay, now I have to manage something else. But actually, a lot of the ideas from democratic education can be practically used in classrooms. It's, again, focusing in on the needs, understanding that spectrum around control and autonomy, and really focusing in on, like, what do I need my students to show me to prove that they're understanding, they're engaged in the learning, and maybe a lot less than what we've been doing. I think conversations should continue happening, especially across the different opportunities, because too many mainstream educators that I know had never heard of democratic education. I hadn't heard about it, and I've been in the classroom for 10 years. But when we're thinking about what can I learn from someone else, rather than this is putting something else on my plate, we are becoming the open-minded learners that we want to present to our students. And there's so much space to create agency with our students and with each other as colleagues. And it all starts from having conversations like this.
Exactly. I go to conferences all over the world, and I go to conferences of all across that spectrum. From the mainstream, I've been to ASCD in Chicago some years ago, all the way to International Democratic Education Conference, which is coming up in Belgium. Going to all these different, and everything in between, is it's not there's not like this over here and this over here and some big infinite gulf in between. That's not real. It is a spectrum of stuff, and there's interesting stuff all across that spectrum. And what would define the spectrum is just the ways that needs are supported. At the extreme, they're being neglected or thwarted. the opposite. But those should not even be considered schools. Those are just dysfunctional institutions. That's not a school if needs are being neglected. But if you're operating as a school, supporting learning, schools fundamentally are about learning, right? Some people say, well, schools are about teaching. Teaching often happens. In fact, every school I've ever heard of, teaching happens. But how you organize it may differ a lot. But the fundamental thing, what should be the defining feature of school, is facilitation of learning. And learning has to be in that open-minded, need-supportive way. That's the only kind of school that can exist. If it's not happening, it's not school. That's something I'm really adamant about. So we have to understand this spectrum and say, okay, it can be organized a lot of different ways. And the question is, what are you emphasizing? One of the ways that I kind of have organized it in one of my books, this one right here, the big thick one, Schooling for Holistic Equity, is I talk about it as certain types of schools emphasize competence. And that's usually mainstream, and they're trying to build skills and things like that. They're misunderstanding competence sometimes a little bit, but that's what they're after. That's the good. That's taking it as of course they're doing something good, and something good would be competence emphasis. There's another set of schools that are really focused on the autonomy. The autonomy in the sense that, like, if you think of traditional in the US, we have these things called community colleges. And what they are is they put out a slate of courses, and you get to choose anything you want. You could take one class, you could take a lot of classes. You can pursue a degree, you could not pursue a degree. That was the original notion of community college. It has become somewhat more focused on where we're just going to train people for jobs. That's a later development. The original idea was communities should take a responsibility for educating our citizens. And so you do this. That's all about autonomy. Pick and choose. And then there's the ones that are focused exclusively on relatedness. And that's where I think the democratic schools are the most extreme expression, is like relatedness is all they do. They're well, that's overstating it, but because they do make experts available for other kinds of learning. But fundamentally, what you can get, the only things you can be kicked out for is not participating in resolving conflicts or making decisions. And that's the foundations of relatedness. Relationship with their students is the thing they focus on the most. So you have these different ways, and I use the needs to say there is a good thing at the heart of these things fundamentally, but they're organized. You really have to organize them differently when you're doing those different emphases. And so to me, the ultimate vision of a functional, proper school system is it has kind of a way to move from one kind of environment to another, once again, as an expression of your own agency. You would always start in relationship and relatedness. And so it should be democratic decision making and participating in conflict resolution and developing those skills. But the focus being the relationship. Everyone should start there. That's what I think a primary school should be defined as. Then you should have this experimentation phase, or it could be defined as a phase, but opportunity, where you can be autonomous. That's that community college model. Just pick and choose, see what happens. Find those things that you're passionate about. Find out, like, okay, that seemed interesting, but it's actually seems really boring, or it isn't my skill set, or I just didn't find the right people there, whatever. But having that phase of autonomy. And then what is now recognized as tertiary education should be, it doesn't need to change very much. It just does that thing where, okay, I'm going to dive in deep. I'm going to geek out. I'm going to get a degree. I'm going to, and it can look like I'm going to do it through a liberal arts structure, and I'm going to say I'm going to get a broad exposure, but eventually I'm going to major in something. Or it could be I'm just going to focus on my subject, and I'm just going to, like vocational schools tend to be that way. I'm going to focus on this one industry and just nail it and get productive in it right away. But mastery is another way to say that, is that the mastery oriented, but I would call that competence focused. So to me, there's this ideal sort of, and none of them should be defined by age, except to say that the relatedness one probably people will age out of it, but it should be as soon as people are willing to be there and follow the rules, they can be in it. And then no defining age thing for any of the others. It's like, hey, if the 12-year-old can do the graduate level course, great, have them take it. That doesn't make any sense for age to be a thing. Now, they should be supported to have an access to that relatedness focused community, no matter how old they are. I mean, up until probably 25 or something like that. But they should have the access to those higher levels to the degree that they can demonstrate that they will succeed there, that they want to do it, and that they have the skills to do it. So it doesn't erase aspects of the current system. It just says, well, it should go from basically kindergarten and then community college and then higher ed, like true degree granting higher ed.
Yeah, it's a very interesting idea. And I know we've talked about it before, that having all aspects of the needs framework really embedded in the school, it already kind of shows up when teachers begin their year with relationship building
Right.
the classroom community. But then we tend to jump into autonomy and relatedness together. I'm also thinking about professional development for teachers, how
Right.
we tend to skip completely over the relatedness. This associate comes in and says, I'm going to teach you today. and we have no relationship to them, so why are we going to listen to them teach us? But it's fascinating to have these conversations, and I know that anyone listening can always go over to Don's channel. I'll link it below, plus all the resources that he shared throughout these conversations, because we're actually going to keep working on talking about schools.
Yeah.
I'm going to have conversations with some of these democratic and alternative education schools over the summertime, North American summer. Keep bringing in all of these ideas and making them presentable to anyone watching here on YouTube. And I think that as we go forward, it's a lot more about finding spaces for agency and not thinking about the logistics as a spot that's holding you back from having the autonomy and competence and relatedness included in the way that you teach and the way that you relate to others in your school system.
Right. And I have resources to really look at specific behaviors that teachers typically do that is entirely drawn from the research literature. And here's the well-being effects from that. So some things are negative in the well-being, like conditional positive regard. Say, well, I'm only going to give them good attention if they do my bidding. That's not a good thing. That's actually one of the more negative things. Ignoring students is amazingly negative. Just not even paying attention to them. But unconditional positive regard is a really positive one. Interesting one. A lot of times people think that giving punishments fairly would be a good thing. Well, giving punishments unfairly is really negative. But even doing it fairly is still negative in terms of well-being consequences. But anyway, I just brought that up. So there's a resource that we'll link to. My website is called holisticequity.org. In addition to my YouTube channel, I have a website where I've collected these resources and have a variety of things available. So
yes, and you have so many resources that if you've enjoyed this conversation, Don has stuff all over the web, plus the books that he's created. And there's so much we could continue talking about. I'm mindful of the time. Yes. And I think that I'm going to continue to tease that series that's coming up on Don's channel, because these are the conversations that help us think about what we want education to look like in the future. When we bring in other voices, when we collaborate with other educators and folks who care about the future of education, we realize that instead of thinking about the bubble that we currently exist in, there's many more opportunities that we might not even have exposure to before. And that's one thing that I want to continue to bring to you on this channel. And I thank Don Berg so much for being here today. I really enjoyed having our conversation, and I think we're going to continue to collaborate.
Absolutely. Yeah, looking forward to it.
Wonderful. So make sure you check out all the things in the description below. I've linked everything, including the Back to Basics 2.0 that Don mentioned, and a resource guide for any teachers who want to take the practical steps to bringing more agency and student autonomy into your classroom. All right, that's all we have for you today. So thank you for being with us, and we'll see you on Don's channel.